So Matthews, you wake up tomorrow morning and you're President of the United States. What's going to be your first line of business?
Well, I think one of the first things that we need to be focusing on in this nation, especially in light of the current fiscal crisis that we find ourselves in, is what are we doing as a nation? Where are we spending money that could be better spent in other things? Right now we're talking about $700 billion bailing out Wall Street, and in the meantime we're spending $10 billion a month in Iraq, 5 years into a war with no discernible objectives. We've done everything we could have possibly hoped to do. We've established no weapons of mass destruction. We've gotten rid of Saddam Hussein. We've replaced the government. They've had democratic elections, and their economy is stable enough that they're currently looking at about an $80 billion budget surplus. With that in mind, I think it's time for us to take that $10 billion a month that we're spending in Iraq and start thinking about how we can shore up our own economic landscape.
So what are you saying, that we should now leave?
Yes, absolutely. We should have left a long time ago, but I think right now we've got every reason in the world to declare victory and go home.
But Matthew, let me ask you this. If we had decided to pick up and leave a long time ago, we certainly wouldn't have Iraq situated in the present position of some level of security as it stands today. I mean, it would have been we would have been departing at a time when the country's security would have been in serious question, right? Now it's at a point post-surge where the country is stabilizing, and maybe we should just give it a bit more time, don't you think?
Not really, and I'll tell you why not. Because that kind of logic suggests that if we leave, that the Iraqis are going to be left to their own defenses and worst possible scenarios are going to come true. What that line of thinking disregards is the rest of the world. We have the United Nations, and what I'm suggesting is that if the majority of the U.S. forces were to withdraw, and the majority of U.S. funding for those forces were to withdraw, then at that point we could rely on the international community much more so than we have up to this point to coordinate stabilization efforts within Iraq.
Well, let me ask you this about that. Has the United Nations shown any leadership in that regard? Hasn't the United Nations actually been failing in that regard for decades now in terms of stabilizing countries that are in turmoil, and particularly Iraq? When we wanted a consensus from the nations in the United Nations, basically they abandoned us, and we had to put together our own coalition, which even fell apart as time went on too. Look at Spain's departure just after the Al-Qaeda explosions there on those trains in Barcelona, was it? But I mean, what I'm saying is that aren't we foolish to rely on the United Nations to assist us in the further stabilization of Iraq?
Well, hindsight's always 20/20, and I think when we look back on the United Nations' previous work in Iraq, we have to acknowledge the fact that in 2003, UN weapons inspectors said that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, ignoring this, the United States voted to go into Iraq. Now, we had the coalition of the willing, as George Bush put it, but it should be mentioned that this coalition of the willing comprised 10% of the overall force that went into Iraq. 90% of the armed forces in Iraq since 2003 have been United States military. That number, that 10%, has actually been dwindling as nation after nation has withdrawn, failing to see any reason to stay in there any further.
Okay, I understand that, but and by the way, just to clarify, the United Nations did not declare that there never were weapons of mass destruction. They just basically said that they couldn't find them. But
That's true.
But also, with regard to the nations that were part of the coalition, I mean, and we project to here in 2008. It's a fact that the country has progressed towards stabilization with various for various reasons, not the least of which is the surge. And currently we're at pre-surge numbers or less, I believe. And really it is only a matter of time before our troop levels are diminished to the point that maybe even will satisfy you, wouldn't you think?
Well, I definitely think that the surge, whether it's a success or failure, that will continue to be debated from a military perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, for years to come. People will be doing all sorts of analysis of the surge and the war in general, probably for years and years to come. What we need to figure out at this point is, what do we have left to accomplish there? I hear people talking about winning in Iraq, and my question is, winning what? At what point will we have achieved something? There's, in World War II, for instance, we had the complete and unconditional surrender of the Japanese Empire. That was how we know that we had won. And once we had Emperor Hirohito sign that unconditional surrender, we knew we had won. At this stage in the war in Iraq, we really have no benchmarks by which we can say, at this point, we know we've won.
With regard to Japan, after that treaty or surrender was signed, Japan was occupied for 7 years after the end of the World War II. So I mean, just to say that we picked up and, you know, he signed it, we walked away, went home, and, you know, started importing Japanese-made goods into our life here is really not very accurate, because we did occupy Japan for like 7 years until it established itself as a country that could stand on its own freely.
Absolutely. But I would also throw in the example of Vietnam, where we did not keep military bases to the degree that we kept them in Japan after World War II. And today, Vietnam, in terms of its tourist trade, in terms of many of its industries, is a major contender in the South Pacific market.
It is, but let's not forget that our precipitous withdrawal from Vietnam led to millions of lives being lost and both in Vietnam itself and in Cambodia and such. Don't forget the Khmer Rouge and such. So I mean, I don't believe a precipitous withdrawal from Iraq is a wise thing when all signs point in the direction of our being able to leave the country in a very stable place.
Well, I think at this point in Iraq, it has been established on the world stage that the United States is prepared to go into Iraq if the situation grows untenable. Having said that, if we were at this point to have, as you say, a precipitous withdrawal from Iraq, we could at that point say, listen, between the troops that we are going to leave behind, we have military bases right now in Germany, left over from World War II, the Philippines, as you said, Japan, South Korea. We have every expectation that we will maintain some sort of military presence, even if it's just one base, in Iraq.
So that's the first line of business for you. The second thing would be what?
Second thing would be addressing the nation's healthcare issues. The nation's healthcare issues, I believe, are vital to not only our economic future, but to our national security. Simply put, a nation of sick and weak people are easy to conquer both economically and militarily, and I believe that the federal government has an obligation to address the 40-some million Americans currently without health insurance, and to make sure, to make it a priority on a federal level, that the federal government ensures quality health care for all American citizens.
The first two lines of business if you were president tomorrow. Yes. Thanks for coming in, Matthew. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Good talking.